Hey guys, tonight we're diving into December 2nd, 1805, a date that would reshape the entire European continent in just 12 hours. Picture this. You're standing in the pre-dawn darkness of Moravia, your breath forming clouds in the bitter cold as three of Europe's most powerful emperors prepare for what will become history's most perfectly executed battle. The temperature hovers just below freezing, and somewhere in that darkness, 158,000 men are about to collide in a symphony of musket fire, cannon smoke, and tactical genius that you probably won't survive if you're unlucky enough to be carrying a bayonet instead of watching from the comfort of your bed. But here's the question that will keep you awake tonight. How did Napoleon Bonaparte, outnumbered and seemingly trapped, turn certain defeat into his greatest victory? The answer lies in a masterpiece of deception, so brilliant that military academies still study it today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world you're joining me for these midnight history sessions. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before dawn on December 2nd, 1805, in a world where empires rise and fall based on a single day's work. The Holy Roman Empire, which has existed for over 1,000 years, will effectively die today, though Emperor Francis II doesn't know it yet as he huddles around a campfire with his Austrian generals. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, barely 28 years old and burning with ambition, paces restlessly through his tent, convinced that today he'll crush the upstart Corsican who dares call himself Emperor of the French. Meanwhile, Napoleon Bonaparte sits calmly in his headquarters at the Château de Austerlitz, studying maps by candlelight. At 36, he's already conquered most of Europe, but today will cement his reputation as history's greatest military tactician. The irony: he's about to win this battle not through superior numbers or equipment, but through pure psychological warfare. You can feel the tension crackling through the frozen air as 73,000 French soldiers prepare to face 85,000 Allied troops. The odds seem impossible, but Napoleon has spent weeks orchestrating what amounts to the world's deadliest magic trick. He's deliberately made himself appear weak, vulnerable, almost defeated, and the Allied commanders have swallowed the bait completely. The morning mist clings to the ground like a living thing, reducing visibility to mere yards. This isn't just atmospheric drama. It's a crucial tactical element that Napoleon will exploit with surgical precision. Historians still argue whether the emperor actually prayed for this fog or simply adapted brilliantly to the conditions. But either way, Mother Nature is about to become his most valuable ally. As you stand in that freezing darkness, you're witnessing the final moments before military history's most studied engagement. The Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, will be over by sunset, but its consequences will echo through European politics for the next decade. The Third Coalition against France is about to shatter like glass, and with it, the old medieval order that has governed Europe since Charlemagne. You hear the distant sound of cavalry horses stamping their hooves, the metallic clink of muskets being checked one final time, and the low murmur of soldiers whispering prayers in German, Russian, and French. Some of these men are writing final letters to wives they'll never see again. Others are sharing their last rations with comrades who won't live to see another meal. The human cost of imperial ambition is about to be written in blood across the snow-covered fields of Moravia. But here's what makes this morning truly extraordinary. Napoleon isn't just planning to win. He's planning to win so decisively that his enemies will never dare challenge him again. He's about to demonstrate that warfare isn't just about courage and numbers, but about understanding human psychology, exploiting terrain, and timing your moves with the precision of a master chess player. The stage is set, the players are in position, and in just a few hours, you'll witness why December 2nd, 1805, became known as the Son of Austerlitz, Napoleon's brightest day and Europe's darkest hour for those who dared oppose him. The sun rises slowly over the Moravian countryside, burning through the morning mist like a divine spotlight illuminating history's greatest stage. You watch as Napoleon emerges from his headquarters, and there's something almost supernatural about the timing, as if the emperor has choreographed even the weather to serve his purposes. This moment will become legend. The sun of Austerlitz, shining down on what Napoleon himself will later call the most beautiful day of my life. But here's the brilliant deception you're witnessing. While that sun climbs higher, Napoleon is putting on the performance of his lifetime. For weeks, he's been playing the role of a desperate, retreating commander. His scouts have been deliberately captured carrying fake dispatches about French weakness. His supply lines appear stretched to breaking point. His soldiers look demoralized as they abandon strategic positions. It's all theater, and the Allied commanders are applauding from the front row. You can see the French emperor now, riding among his troops with that characteristic calm that unnerves both enemies and allies. At 57, he's not physically imposing, but there's an electric charisma that makes hardened veterans straighten their spines when he passes. Today, he's wearing his famous gray overcoat, the one that will become as iconic as Caesar's purple or Alexander's golden armor. His face shows no trace of the anxiety that should be consuming a general facing superior, numbers on enemy territory. The psychological warfare is breathtaking in its sophistication. Napoleon has spent the previous evening in full view of enemy scouts, apparently arguing with his marshals about retreat routes. He's ordered his baggage trains to move eastward, suggesting panic. Most brilliantly, he's abandoned the Pratzen Heights, the commanding high ground that any competent general would die to hold. To the Allied commanders watching through their telescopes, it looks like amateur hour from the supposedly great Napoleon. What you're really witnessing is military genius disguised as incompetence. Those 73,000 French soldiers aren't retreating. They're repositioning with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every panicked movement has been rehearsed. Every abandoned position is actually a carefully calculated sacrifice. Napoleon is playing chess, while his enemies think they're engaged in checkers. The morning air carries the sound of Allied trumpets as Austrian and Russian forces begin their advance. You can hear the excitement in their voices. They think they're about to capture or kill the most dangerous man in Europe. Emperor Francis II of Austria rides with his generals, already planning victory celebrations. Tsar Alexander I, young and eager for glory, has overruled his experienced advisors who urged caution. The trap is closing, but not in the way the Allies imagine. Here's a detail that most history books miss. Napoleon's soldiers are actually in better condition than they appear. While the Allied forces have been marching through hostile territory for weeks, dealing with stretched supply lines and winter weather, the French have been secretly resupplied and rested. Those demoralized troops you see shuffling through the morning mist, they're some of the most experienced veterans in Europe, many of whom have been fighting alongside Napoleon since his Italian campaigns. The emperor's staff work is equally impressive. His intelligence network has provided detailed information about Allied troop movements, command structure, and even the personality quirks of enemy generals. He knows that Alexander is impetuous and glory-hungry. He understands that Francis is cautious but can be pressured by his allies. Most importantly, he's identified the exact moment when the Allied army will be most vulnerable, when they're committed to their attack but not yet in position to support each other. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's famous son of Austerlitz comment was made before or after the battle, but the symbolism is perfect either way. As that December sun climbs higher, it's illuminating not just a battlefield but the birth of a new European order, the medieval world of hereditary monarchs ruling by divine right is about to collide with the modern reality of merit-based leadership and revolutionary warfare. You notice something else as the morning progresses. The French army's organization is subtly different from their opponents. While the Allied forces are arranged in traditional formations that haven't changed much since the 7 Years' War, Napoleon's corps system allows for unprecedented flexibility. Each corps is essentially a miniature army capable of independent action, and today they'll demonstrate why this innovation revolutionized military science. The temperature is rising with the sun, and you can see steam beginning to rise from the warming ground. This isn't just atmospheric detail, it's tactical intelligence. Napoleon's engineers have studied this terrain for weeks, and they know exactly how the changing conditions will affect visibility, footing, and artillery effectiveness. Every environmental factor has been calculated and incorporated into the battle plan. As you stand there in the growing daylight, watching two of Europe's greatest armies prepare to clash, you're witnessing the moment when warfare evolved from medieval pageantry to modern science. The sun of Austerlitz isn't just lighting up a battlefield, it's illuminating the future. You find yourself standing beside Tsar Alexander I of Russia as he surveys the battlefield from his command position. And immediately you understand why this 28-year-old emperor is about to make one of history's most catastrophic military decisions. There's something almost tragic about watching youthful arrogance collide with experienced wisdom, like watching a teenager argue with their grandfather about driving in a snowstorm. Except the stakes here involve the lives of 85,000 men. Alexander cuts an impressive figure in his pristine uniform, all gold braid and imperial confidence. He's tall, handsome, and radiating the kind of self-assurance that comes from never having been seriously challenged. Born into absolute power, educated by the finest tutors in Europe, he genuinely believes that his royal blood grants him tactical genius. It's the kind of dangerous delusion that makes you want to shake him by the shoulders and shout, "Listen to your generals." But of course, that's exactly what his advisors have been trying to do for weeks. The most experienced voice in the Allied camp belongs to Mikhail Kutuzov, the grizzled Russian general who lost an eye fighting the Turks and has forgotten more about warfare than most men ever learn. You watch as this 60-year-old veteran tries one last time to counsel caution, his scarred face grave with concern. "Your Majesty," he argues, "Napoleon is too experienced a commander to place himself in such an apparently hopeless position without some hidden advantage." But Alexander waves him off with the casual dismissal of youth confronting age. Here's what makes this moment so painfully ironic. Kutuzov is absolutely right, and everyone except the Tsar seems to know it. The Austrian generals are nervous. The Russian staff officers are exchanging worried glances. Even the common soldiers sense something isn't quite right about this easy victory they're being promised. But Alexander has already made up his mind, and when you're an absolute monarch, your word becomes reality. even when reality is about to become a nightmare. The young Tsar's reasoning seems logical on the surface. Napoleon appears to be retreating. The French have abandoned strong defensive positions. Their supply lines look stretched to the breaking point. Most convincingly, they're outnumbered by more than 10,000 men. In Alexander's mind, this is the perfect opportunity to crush the upstart Corsican and restore the proper order of European monarchy. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. But you can see how the trap works from Alexander's perspective. Napoleon has been so convincing in his performance of weakness that even experienced generals are starting to believe it. The French emperor's reputation for invincibility has actually worked against him here. Surely no commander, no matter how brilliant, would willingly accept such disadvantageous terms unless he had no choice. You notice something fascinating about the cultural dynamics at play. Alexander represents the old European aristocracy, where military command was inherited rather than earned. He's never had to prove himself through the brutal meritocracy that forged Napoleon's career. While the French emperor rose from artillery lieutenant to emperor through pure talent and ruthless ambition, Alexander became Tsar simply by being born to the right parents. It's a collision between two entirely different concepts of leadership. The morning conference between Allied commanders becomes increasingly heated as you observe from the sidelines. Austrian Emperor Francis II, older and more cautious than his Russian ally, suggests waiting for reinforcements. Several generals propose alternative strategies that would minimize risk. But Alexander's blood is up, and he's surrounded by courtiers who have spent their careers telling him what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. Here's a detail that most historians overlook. Alexander is also motivated by personal rivalry with Napoleon. The French emperor is only 8 years older, but he's already conquered most of Europe, while Alexander has spent his reign dealing with palace intrigue and administrative reforms. There's a psychological element here. The young Tsar needs to prove himself worthy of comparison to the man who's redrawing the map of Europe. Historians still argue whether Alexander's decision was influenced more by inexperience or by the pressure of coalition politics, but the result is the same. He's about to order 85,000 men into a carefully prepared killing ground. The tragedy is that he genuinely believes he's making the smart play. In his mind, he's the hero of this story, the young emperor who will save Europe from the Corsican tyrant. You can see the exact moment when Alexander makes his final decision. His jaw sets with imperial determination, and he turns to his staff with the kind of confident smile that makes your blood run cold. "Gentlemen," he announces, "today we end Napoleon's career." The words hang in the cold morning air like a death sentence, though not for the man he intends. As the orders go out to begin the Allied advance, you realize you're witnessing one of history's great what-if moments. If Alexander had listened to Kutuzov, if he'd waited for reinforcements, if he'd recognized the trap for what it was, the entire course of European history, you're positioned on the Pratzen Heights as Napoleon makes the most counterintuitive decision in military history, deliberately abandoning the best defensive position on the entire battlefield. It's like watching a chess grandmaster sacrifice his queen in the opening moves, either brilliant beyond comprehension or completely insane. As French troops begin their retreat from these commanding hills, you can practically hear the Allied commanders celebrating through their telescopes. The Pratzen Heights dominate the battlefield like a medieval castle overlooks a village. From up here, artillery can command every approach, infantry can see enemy movements for miles, and any attacking force has to climb uphill into the teeth of defensive fire. Military doctrine going back to Alexander the Great says you hold the high ground at all costs. Napoleon is about to prove that sometimes the greatest strength comes from apparent weakness. What you're witnessing is psychological warfare elevated to an art form. Those French soldiers marching down from the heights aren't retreating in panic. They're actors in the most elaborate military theater ever staged. Every stumble looks accidental, but is carefully choreographed. Every abandoned supply wagon has been strategically placed to suggest hasty flight. Even the timing of the withdrawal has been calculated to maximize the impression of French desperation. You can see Allied scouts racing back to their commanders with reports of French weakness. They're abandoning the heights. Napoleon is in full retreat. The road to Vienna lies open. Each breathless report adds another layer to the deception. The irony is delicious. The better Napoleon's performance, the more confident his enemies become, and the deeper they walk into his trap. Here's the tactical genius you're observing. Napoleon isn't just giving up the high ground. He's using it as bait. He knows that any competent enemy commander will immediately move to occupy such valuable terrain. More importantly, he knows that seizing the Pratzen Heights will require the Allies to stretch their battle line thin, creating exactly the vulnerability he needs to exploit. It's like offering your opponent a poisoned chalice disguised as fine wine. The morning mist swirls around the heights as the last French soldiers disappear into the valley below. You notice something that the Allied observers miss. These aren't Napoleon's best troops making this retreat. The Emperor has carefully selected which units to sacrifice in this deception, keeping his elite formations hidden and ready for the real battle to come. It's the kind of detail that separates good generals from great ones. Marshal Soult, commanding the French IV Corps, receives his final briefings as you watch from nearby. This grizzled veteran understands exactly what's being asked of him. Wait until the Allies commit to occupying the heights, then retake them with a lightning assault that will split the enemy army in half. It sounds simple, but the timing has to be perfect. Attack too early and the trap fails. Attack too late and the French army gets crushed between superior numbers. The psychological pressure on Napoleon must be enormous, but his face shows nothing but calm confidence. He's betting his entire career, his empire, and the lives of 73,000 men on a single gamble. If this goes wrong, he won't just lose a battle, he'll lose everything. The Allied armies will march on Paris. The French Empire will collapse, and Napoleon Bonaparte will become a footnote in history as the general who got too clever for his own good. You can hear the excitement building in the Allied camps as their commanders realize what they think is happening. Emperor Francis II is already discussing how to divide French territory after Napoleon's inevitable surrender. Tsar Alexander is planning his triumphant entry into Paris. The Austrian and Russian generals are arguing about who gets credit for the victory. It's premature celebration on an epic scale. But here's what makes Napoleon's gambit so brilliant. He's not just abandoning the heights, he's controlling exactly how the Allies will occupy them. By timing his withdrawal perfectly, he's ensuring that enemy forces will be climbing those slopes at precisely the moment when they're most vulnerable to counterattack. The Pratzen Heights will become a trap disguised as a prize. Historians still argue whether Napoleon planned this exact scenario or adapted brilliantly to unexpected circumstances. But the result is the same. He's turned his greatest apparent weakness into his secret weapon. The high ground that should have guaranteed Allied victory is about to become the instrument of their destruction. As you watch the last French soldiers disappear into the morning mist, you realize you're witnessing military genius in its purest form. Napoleon isn't just fighting this battle. He's rewriting the rules of warfare itself. The Pratzen Heights Gambit will be studied in military academies for the next 2 centuries. But right now, you're stumbling through fog so thick you can barely see your own feet. And suddenly, you understand why this battle will be remembered as much for what couldn't be seen as for what actually happened. The morning mist clings to the Moravian countryside like a living thing, reducing the world to a gray bubble extending maybe 30 yards in any direction. For 85,000 Allied soldiers advancing toward what they believe is certain victory, this fog is about to become their worst nightmare. The sensory deprivation is almost complete. You hear the crunch of frost-covered grass under thousands of marching feet, the metallic clink of bayonets and sabers, the nervous whinnying of cavalry horses who sense their riders' tension. But you can't see the man next to you clearly, let alone coordinate with units that might as well be on another planet. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra while blindfolded, except the musicians are carrying muskets and the wrong note gets you killed. What makes this fog particularly treacherous is how it plays with sound. Voices seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. The rumble of artillery wheels echoes strangely, making it impossible to judge distance or direction. You hear Russian officers shouting orders in one direction, Austrian commands in another, but the words seem disconnected from any visible source. It's psychological warfare courtesy of Mother Nature, and Napoleon couldn't have ordered better conditions if he'd had a direct line to the weather gods. Here's where the Allied advance begins to fall apart. Coordination becomes nearly impossible when you can't see your own troops, let alone the enemy. The carefully planned battle formations that looked so impressive on paper start to dissolve into confused clusters of men trying not to lose contact with their units. Officers ride back and forth desperately trying to maintain some semblance of order, but they're essentially playing blind man's bluff with 85,000 pieces. You watch, or rather, you listen, as the Austrian columns begin their assault on what they believe are French positions. The sound is terrifying. Thousands of men moving through the mist like ghosts, their equipment creating a symphony of metallic whispers. But here's the cruel irony. Many of these French positions they're attacking are either empty or lightly held. Napoleon has pulled back his main forces, leaving just enough resistance to maintain the illusion, while the real French army prepares its counterstroke. The fog creates a strange intimacy on the battlefield. You find yourself close enough to hear individual conversations between enemy soldiers, their voices floating disembodied through the gray void. A young Austrian private whispers to his sergeant about a letter from his sweetheart. Russian veterans share dark jokes about previous battles. French skirmishers, hidden in the mist, report enemy movements in hushed tones that somehow carry further than they should in the thick air. Marshal Soult's IV Corps is moving through this same fog, but with a crucial difference. They know exactly where they're going. While the Allies stumble forward into unknown terrain, the French have spent weeks studying every hill, stream, and farmhouse in the area. Napoleon's mapmakers have created detailed charts showing not just roads and landmarks, but also the subtle terrain features that become crucial when visibility drops to zero. You can hear the growing confusion in Allied ranks as units begin to lose contact with each other. The fog that was supposed to provide concealment for their advance is instead breaking apart their carefully coordinated attack. Russian columns drift away from their Austrian allies. Cavalry units find themselves separated from the infantry they're supposed to support. What should have been a unified assault is becoming a series of isolated, piecemeal attacks, exactly what Napoleon hoped for. The psychological effect is devastating. Soldiers who were confident and eager at dawn are now nervous and disoriented. The fog transforms familiar countryside into an alien landscape where every shadow might hide an enemy, and every sound could signal disaster. You can hear the change in voices. The bold commands of early morning have given way to uncertain whispers and nervous questions. Here's a detail that most accounts miss. The fog affects different parts of the battlefield unevenly. While the main Allied advance struggles through near-zero visibility, some areas remain relatively clear. Napoleon's scouts have been tracking these conditions all morning, adjusting French positions to take advantage of every pocket of clear air while leaving the Allies to stumble through the worst of the mist. Historians still argue whether Napoleon actually prayed for this fog or simply adapted brilliantly to the conditions. But either way, it's becoming his most valuable ally. The weather that should have favored the larger Allied army is instead neutralizing their numerical advantage and playing directly into French tactical superiority. As you move through this gray world, you realize you're witnessing warfare's ultimate equalizer. All the careful planning, all the numerical advantages, all the strategic positioning, none of it matters when you can't see your enemy until you're close enough to count the buttons on his uniform. The fog of war isn't just a metaphor today. It's a literal force that's about to determine the fate of Europe. The moment has arrived for Marshal Soult's lightning strike, and you're charging up the Pratzen Heights with the French IV Corps in what will become the most decisive flanking maneuver in military history. The fog is finally beginning to lift, revealing the shocking sight of Austrian and Russian troops scattered across the very heights they thought they'd captured. What seemed like Allied victory just moments ago is about to transform into catastrophic defeat, and you're witnessing the exact instant when Napoleon's trap springs shut. Soult's men move with the precision of a Swiss watch mechanism. These aren't raw recruits stumbling through their first battle. They're veterans of the Italian campaigns, hardened soldiers who have followed Napoleon from victory to victory across Europe. You can feel their confidence as they advance up the slopes, bayonets fixed, moving in perfect formation despite the treacherous terrain. They know they're about to make history, and there's something almost supernatural about their discipline under fire. The Allied forces on the Pratzen Heights are caught in the worst possible position, spread thin across unfamiliar ground, separated from their supporting units, and completely unprepared for a coordinated French assault. You watch as Russian infantry, who thought they were pursuing a beaten enemy, suddenly find themselves facing fresh French troops attacking uphill with devastating effectiveness. The psychological shock is as damaging as the physical assault. These men believed they were winning, and now they're fighting for their lives. Here's where Soult's tactical genius becomes apparent. Instead of a frontal assault that would waste French lives against entrenched positions, he's coordinated a series of converging attacks that hit the Allied forces from multiple directions simultaneously. French artillery, positioned with mathematical precision, begins pounding the heights while infantry advances under covering fire. It's combined arms warfare at its most lethal, and the Allies have no answer for it. You can hear the change in battle sounds as the French assault gains momentum. The confident shouts of Allied officers give way to desperate orders. The steady rhythm of advancing feet becomes the chaotic scramble of men trying to reposition under fire. Most tellingly, the triumphant Russian and Austrian battle cries fade into the grim silence of soldiers who suddenly realize they're in serious trouble. The terrain itself becomes a weapon in French hands. Those slopes that seemed so advantageous to defend are actually perfect for Soult's assault tactics. The French can use the natural contours of the hills to approach unseen, concentrate their forces at key points, and then overwhelm isolated Allied positions before reinforcements can arrive. It's like watching a master chess player sacrifice pawns to position his pieces for checkmate. What makes this assault particularly devastating is its timing. Napoleon has waited until the Allied army is fully committed to their attack on what they believe are retreating French forces. Now, with enemy reserves engaged elsewhere and their command structure stretched to breaking point, Soult's corps hits them where they're weakest. It's the military equivalent of a perfectly timed counterpunch that drops an overconfident boxer. You notice something remarkable about French morale during this assault. These soldiers aren't just following orders. They're executing a plan they understand and believe in. Napoleon has shared enough of his strategy with his troops that they know they're not just attacking a hill. They're delivering the decisive blow that will win the entire battle. That kind of tactical awareness among common soldiers is revolutionary for this era. The fog continues to work in French favor even as it lifts. Patches of mist still cling to the lower slopes, concealing French movements while revealing Allied positions on the heights. It's as if the weather gods have decided to personally assist Napoleon's tactical masterpiece. The irony is perfect. The same fog that confused the Allied advance now provides cover for the French counterattack. Historians still argue whether Soult's assault was always intended as the battle's decisive moment, or whether Napoleon adapted his plan based on how events unfolded. But the execution is flawless either way. The marshal coordinates artillery, infantry, and cavalry with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony orchestra. Every unit knows its role, every attack supports the others, and the cumulative effect is overwhelming. You can see panic beginning to spread through Allied ranks as they realize what's happening. Units that were advancing confidently just minutes ago are now falling back in disorder. Officers who were planning victory celebrations are frantically trying to reorganize their scattered forces. The psychological reversal is as complete as the tactical one. The hunters have become the hunted. The human cost becomes apparent as French bayonets reach the crest of the heights. You see Austrian soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, throwing down their muskets and raising their hands in surrender. Russian veterans, proud men who have never retreated from a fight, find themselves overwhelmed by superior tactics and coordination. It's not cowardice. It's the inevitable result of being caught in an impossible position. Here's a detail that most accounts overlook. The speed of Soult's assault is as important as its power. By moving quickly and decisively, the French prevent the Allies from adapting to the new situation. There's no time for enemy commanders to reorganize their defenses, no opportunity to bring up reserves, no chance to establish new positions. It's blitzkrieg warfare a century before the term was invented. As you reach the summit of the Pratzen Heights with the advancing French forces, you realize you're standing at the exact spot where European history pivots. The heights that were supposed to guarantee Allied victory have become the instrument of their destruction. Napoleon's gamble has paid off in spectacular fashion, and the reversal is so complete that enemy commanders are still trying to understand what happened. The view from the top reveals the full scope of the tactical masterpiece you've just witnessed. Allied forces are scattered and disorganized across the battlefield below, their carefully planned advance transformed into chaotic retreat. Soult's lightning strike hasn't just captured a hill, it's shattered an entire army's cohesion and morale. You're standing at the edge of the Sachin Ponds as one of history's most horrifying battlefield disasters unfolds before your eyes. The ice that seemed so solid this morning is now cracking under the weight of retreating Russian soldiers, and what follows will haunt military historians for centuries. The sound is unlike anything you've ever heard. Not just the sharp crack of breaking ice, but the desperate screams of men who realize they're about to die in the most terrifying way imaginable. The retreat began as an organized withdrawal, but panic spreads through human crowds like fire through dry grass. You watch as disciplined Russian formations dissolve into a mob of terrified soldiers, pushing toward what they believe is safety across the frozen ponds. The irony is cruel. These men survived the French assault on the Pratzen Heights, only to face death by drowning in water so cold it will kill them in minutes even if they can swim. Here's where the physics of winter warfare become deadly. Ice that can support a man walking carefully will shatter under the weight of hundreds of soldiers running in panic. The Sachin ponds aren't deep, maybe 8 to 10 feet at most, but that's more than enough to drown a man weighed down by a heavy wool uniform, leather equipment, and a musket. You can see soldiers disappearing beneath the surface, their hands clawing desperately at ice edges that break away under their grip. Napoleon himself will later ride to this spot and witness the aftermath. Legend says he was so moved by the sight of Russian soldiers drowning that he ordered his men to rescue survivors, though historians still argue whether this act of mercy actually happened or was invented later to humanize the emperor's image. What's certain is that the sight of men dying in freezing water rather than from honorable wounds affects even hardened veterans. The tactical situation makes the tragedy even worse. These aren't cowards fleeing in panic. They're soldiers following orders to retreat across what their officers believed was a safe route. Russian commanders, desperate to save what they can of their shattered forces, directed their men toward the ponds without realizing how the morning's fighting had weakened the ice. Artillery fire and the vibrations from thousands of marching feet have created invisible fractures that turn solid-looking ice into a death trap. You can hear French artillery in the distance, adding to the chaos. Napoleon has ordered his guns to target the retreating columns, and cannonballs splashing into the water create additional waves that further destabilize the ice. It's a calculated decision. The emperor knows that destroying enemy morale is as important as destroying enemy soldiers, and nothing breaks an army's spirit like watching comrades die helplessly. The human drama playing out before you is heartbreaking in its individual details. You see a young Russian officer trying to save his men by spreading them out to distribute the weight, but it's too late. The ice is already compromised. A grizzled sergeant throws his musket aside and attempts to swim to safety, but the freezing water saps his strength within seconds. Most tragically, you witness soldiers who could have escaped choosing instead to try rescuing drowning comrades, only to be pulled under themselves. Here's a detail that most accounts miss. The water temperature is probably around 32 degrees F, just at the freezing point. At this temperature, a human body goes into immediate shock, muscles seize up, and even strong swimmers become helpless within minutes. The heavy woolen uniforms that protect soldiers from winter cold become death sentences in the water, soaking up gallons of freezing liquid and dragging men down like anchors. The sound of the ice breaking creates its own psychological warfare. That sharp, crystalline crack echoes across the battlefield like gunshots, and each sound means more men are falling through to their deaths. French soldiers advancing behind the retreat can hear it clearly, and while some are horrified by what they're witnessing, others see it as divine judgment on their enemies. War has a way of hardening hearts even to the most pitiful suffering. You notice something that will become controversial among historians: the exact number of men who died in the ponds. Napoleon's bulletins will claim hundreds drowned, while Russian sources minimize the casualties. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Maybe 50 to 100 men actually died in the water, but the psychological impact affects thousands more. Sometimes the legend becomes more powerful than the reality. The rescue attempts are as dangerous as the original disaster. French soldiers, despite being enemies just hours ago, risk their own lives trying to pull Russian survivors from the freezing water. You see improvised ropes made from musket slings, human chains formed to reach drowning men, and acts of individual heroism that transcend national boundaries. War may be politics by other means, but human compassion occasionally breaks through even the most brutal circumstances. Marshal Devout's corps, advancing to exploit the Allied retreat, reaches the ponds just as the worst of the drowning is occurring. These hardened veterans, who have seen every form of battlefield death imaginable, are visibly shaken by the sight of enemy soldiers dying so helplessly. Some French officers order their men to help with rescue efforts, while others maintain that their duty is to pursue the retreating enemy. It's a moral complexity that will haunt participants for years afterward. Historians still argue whether Napoleon deliberately targeted the ice, or whether the drownings were an unintended consequence of normal artillery fire. But the result is the same. The Sachin ponds become a symbol of Austerlitz's horror as well as its glory. The image of men drowning in sight of safety will be remembered long after the tactical details of the battle fade from memory. As you stand there watching this tragedy unfold, you realize you're witnessing one of those moments when the human cost of imperial ambition becomes impossible to ignore. These aren't statistics in a military report. They're individual human beings dying in terror and agony because 3 emperors couldn't resolve their differences through diplomacy. The Ice Lake Massacre will become part of Austerlitz's legend, a reminder that even the most brilliant victories exact. You're riding alongside Emperor Francis II of Austria as the full magnitude of disaster becomes clear, and you can see the exact moment when a 1,000-year-old empire begins to crumble in his eyes. The Holy Roman Empire, which has endured since Charlemagne crowned himself in 800 AD, is dying on this frozen Moravian battlefield, and Francis knows it. His face, pale in the winter sunlight, shows the kind of devastation that comes not from losing a battle, but from watching an entire world order collapse in a single afternoon. The retreat is becoming a rout, and Francis can do nothing but watch as his carefully planned coalition dissolves around him. Austrian regiments that marched out this morning in perfect formation are now streaming past his position in complete disorder. Officers who should be rallying their men are instead focused on saving their own lives. The imperial standards that represented centuries of Habsburg power are being abandoned in muddy fields as their bearers flee toward safety. What makes this moment particularly tragic is Francis's genuine bewilderment. He's not a bad man or even a particularly incompetent ruler. He's simply the last representative of a medieval system trying to function in a modern world. While Napoleon rose through merit and revolutionary energy, Francis inherited his throne through bloodline and tradition. Today, merit is defeating tradition so decisively that the very concept of divine right monarchy is being shattered along with the Austrian battle lines. You can hear the desperation in Francis's voice as he tries to issue orders that no one is in position to follow. "Rally the guards," he shouts to officers who are already miles away. "Hold the center," he commands, not realizing that the center ceased to exist an hour ago. It's like watching a conductor trying to direct an orchestra that has already left the concert hall. The gestures are correct, but there's no one left to respond. The personal cost to Francis goes beyond military defeat. His younger brother, Archduke Ferdinand, was supposed to command the Austrian forces today, but inexperience and Napoleon's tactical brilliance have left the young prince completely outmaneuvered. Francis can see his family's military reputation, built over centuries of European warfare, being destroyed in real time. The Habsburgs have ruled through prestige and perceived invincibility. Both are evaporating like morning mist. Here's where the political implications become staggering. The Holy Roman Empire isn't just losing a battle, it's losing its reason for existence. This ramshackle collection of German states, held together by tradition and Habsburg authority, has been weakening for decades. Napoleon's victory today will provide the excuse for German princes to abandon their imperial allegiance and join the French-sponsored Confederation of the Rhine. Francis is watching his empire fragment before his eyes. The irony is bitter. Francis came to Austerlitz hoping to restore the old European balance of power, but instead he's accelerating its destruction. Every Austrian regiment that breaks and runs, every imperial standard abandoned in the mud, every officer who surrenders rather than die for his emperor, all of it undermines the mystique that has kept the Holy Roman Empire functioning despite its obvious obsolescence. You notice something heartbreaking about the emperor's entourage. These courtiers and generals who spent the morning discussing victory celebrations are now quietly calculating how to save their own positions in the new order that Napoleon is creating. The same men who assured Francis that the French were beaten are now suggesting that perhaps it's time to negotiate. Loyalty, it turns out, is often conditional on success. The retreat route tells its own story of imperial collapse. You pass abandoned artillery pieces bearing the double-headed eagle of Austria, supply wagons overturned in haste, and personal belongings scattered by soldiers who chose speed over possessions. Each discarded item represents not just military defeat, but the breakdown of the discipline and pride that held the Austrian army together. Francis's personal courage is never in question. He remains with his troops even as the situation becomes hopeless, and he'll continue trying to organize resistance long after any rational commander would have fled. But courage without competence is often just another form of tragedy, and the emperor's determination to do his duty only makes the disaster more poignant. Historians still argue whether the Holy Roman Empire could have survived even without Austerlitz, but Napoleon's victory certainly provides the final push toward dissolution. Within months, Francis will formally abandon the title of Holy Roman Emperor, keeping only his hereditary Austrian crown. A political entity that survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, and the Protestant Reformation will finally succumb to French bayonets and revolutionary ideology. The human cost of this imperial collapse extends far beyond the battlefield. Thousands of Austrian and Allied soldiers are dead, wounded, or captured, but the political casualties may be even greater. The old certainties that governed European politics for centuries are being swept away, and Francis represents the last generation of rulers who genuinely believed in the divine right of kings. As you ride with the retreating emperor, you can see him aging before your eyes. The confident monarch who woke up this morning expecting to humble Napoleon has been replaced by a broken man who understands that his world is ending. The Holy Roman Empire will officially die in 1806, but you're witnessing its real death throes here on the frozen fields of Austerlitz. The bitter irony is that Francis's defeat will ultimately benefit his own people. The archaic Holy Roman Empire, with its confusing jurisdictions and medieval inefficiencies, was holding back German economic and political development. Napoleon's victory will force modernization, and eventually you're fighting alongside Prince Pyotr Bagration and his outnumbered Russian rearguard as they attempt one of military history's most desperate holding actions. And the courage you're witnessing defies every rational calculation of survival. While the main Allied army dissolves into chaos around the Sachin Ponds, Bagration's men are buying time with their lives, standing firm against overwhelming French pressure in a display of military heroism that will echo through Russian military tradition for generations. Bagration himself is a study in controlled fury, a Georgian prince who spent his career fighting everyone from Turks to Poles, and who understands that sometimes honor matters more than survival. You can see him moving among his troops with the calm confidence of a man who's already accepted death, encouraging his soldiers not with promises of victory, but with appeals to duty and brotherhood. "We hold here," he tells his officers, "not because we can win, but because our comrades need time to escape." The tactical situation is hopeless by any objective measure. Bagration's corps is facing at least 2 full French divisions, supported by artillery that's systematically destroying Russian positions. The prince has maybe 8,000 men against more than 20,000 French troops, and his ammunition is running low while enemy reinforcements continue to arrive. It's the kind of mathematical impossibility that should result in immediate surrender, but these Russian soldiers have apparently forgotten how to count. What makes this rearguard action particularly remarkable is its improvised nature. Bagration didn't plan to fight a delaying action here. He's adapting to battlefield conditions with the kind of tactical flexibility that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. Using every farmhouse, stone wall, and natural depression as a defensive position, he's creating a series of strongpoints that force the French to fight for every yard of ground. You can hear the distinctive sound of Russian musketry as Bagration's men deliver disciplined volleys into advancing French columns. These aren't panicked shots fired by frightened recruits. They're carefully aimed rounds delivered by veterans who know their business. The prince has trained his soldiers to make every shot count, and they're proving that lesson with deadly effectiveness even as their position becomes increasingly untenable. The human drama unfolding around you is both inspiring and heartbreaking. You see Russian soldiers sharing their last cartridges with wounded comrades who can still fight. Officers who should be coordinating the retreat instead choose to stay with their men, knowing that leadership by example is the only thing holding this desperate defense together. Most remarkably, you witness acts of individual heroism that serve no tactical purpose except to maintain unit cohesion and morale. Here's where Bagration's military genius becomes apparent. He's not trying to win this fight. He's trying to lose it as slowly as possible. Every minute his rearguard holds is another minute for the main Allied army to escape and reorganize. It's a calculated sacrifice that requires perfect timing. Retreat too early and the delaying action fails. Hold too long and the entire rearguard gets annihilated for no strategic gain. The French assault comes in waves, each one more determined than the last. You can see Marshal Lannes coordinating the attacks with professional respect for his opponents. These French veterans recognize courage when they see it, even in enemy ranks. The assault troops advance with the grim determination of men who know they're facing soldiers who won't break easily. And the resulting combat is as brutal as anything you'll see on any battlefield. Russian artillery, what little remains of it, is firing over open sights at French formations barely 100 yards away. The gunners know they're in a duel they can't win, but they're making the French pay for every position. You watch as Russian cannoneers continue serving their guns even after most of their crews are casualties, loading and firing with the mechanical precision of men who have accepted their fate. The retreat, when it finally comes, is a masterpiece of military discipline under impossible conditions. Bagration doesn't simply order his men to run. He conducts a fighting withdrawal that maintains unit integrity even as French pressure intensifies. Companies leapfrog backward from position to position, each one covering the others in a textbook example of how to retreat without becoming a mob. Historians still argue whether Bagration's rearguard action actually saved significant numbers of Allied troops, or whether it was simply a heroic gesture that accomplished little beyond maintaining Russian honor. But the psychological impact is undeniable. These soldiers are proving that the Allied army, despite its crushing defeat, still contains men willing to die for their comrades and their cause. You notice something remarkable about the French response to this desperate resistance. Even enemy soldiers are showing grudging admiration for Bagration's stand. French officers who should be pressing their advantage instead pause to allow Russian wounded to be evacuated. It's the kind of professional courtesy between warriors that transcends national boundaries, a recognition that courage deserves respect regardless of which uniform it wears. The personal cost to Bagration's corps is staggering. Units that began the day at full strength are reduced to handfuls of survivors. Regimental colors that represented centuries of Russian military tradition are being saved only through the sacrifice of the men who carried them. The prince himself will survive this action, but many of his best officers and sergeants won't see another dawn. As the rearguard finally breaks contact and begins its retreat, you realize you've witnessed something that transcends mere military tactics. Bagration's stand represents the kind of selfless courage that creates legends and inspires future generations of soldiers. These men didn't hold their position because they thought they could win. They held it because their honor and their comrades demanded it. The irony is that this heroic failure may be more valuable to Russian military tradition than an easy victory would have been. You're standing beside Napoleon as he surveys his greatest triumph, and the tactical genius you're witnessing is so complete, so perfectly executed, that military academies will study this battle for the next 2 centuries. The emperor's face shows no trace of surprise at the outcome. This isn't luck or accident, but the methodical destruction of an enemy army through superior planning, timing, and psychological warfare. Every element of his strategy has worked exactly as intended, and you're watching the birth of a legend that will define military excellence for generations. The battlefield spread before you tells the story of tactical perfection. French forces have achieved what military theorists call interior lines. The ability to concentrate superior force at decisive points while keeping enemy units separated and unable to support each other. Napoleon hasn't just won a battle. He's demonstrated a new form of warfare that makes traditional European military thinking obsolete overnight. Here's where the emperor's strategic brilliance becomes clear. This victory wasn't achieved through superior numbers or better equipment, but through understanding human psychology and exploiting enemy weaknesses with surgical precision. Every decision Napoleon made, from abandoning the Pratzen Heights to timing Soult's counterattack, was calculated to maximize psychological impact while minimizing French casualties. It's warfare elevated to the level of art. You can see the mathematical elegance of Napoleon's battle plan as it unfolds across the terrain. The French army has moved like a perfectly coordinated machine, with each corps arriving at exactly the right place at precisely the right moment. Marshal Davout's forced march to secure the right flank, Soult's assault on the Pratzen Heights, Lanz's pressure on the Allied left. Every movement has been choreographed to create maximum confusion among enemy commanders while maintaining perfect French coordination. The intelligence network that made this victory possible is equally impressive. Napoleon's scouts provided detailed information about Allied troop movements, command personalities, and even the specific routes enemy forces would take during their advance. The emperor knew where his enemies would be before they knew it themselves, and he positioned his forces accordingly. It's the kind of information warfare that won't become common until the 20th century. What makes Napoleon's tactical genius particularly remarkable is his ability to adapt in real time. While the overall battle plan was carefully prepared, the emperor made dozens of small adjustments throughout the morning based on changing conditions. When the fog lasted longer than expected, he modified his timing. When Allied resistance proved stronger in some sectors, he shifted resources accordingly. It's the mark of a truly great commander, the ability to think strategically while reacting tactically. You notice something fascinating about French morale during this battle. Napoleon's soldiers aren't just following orders, they're executing a plan they understand and believe in. The emperor has shared enough of his strategy with his officers that they can make intelligent decisions when communication becomes difficult. This kind of mission-type tactics won't become standard military doctrine for another century, but Napoleon is already implementing it with devastating effectiveness. The coordination between different arms of the French military is unprecedented for this era. Artillery, infantry, and cavalry work together with the precision of a Swiss watch, each supporting the others in ways that maximize their combined effectiveness. You watch as French guns provide covering fire for advancing infantry, who then clear enemy positions so cavalry can exploit the breakthrough. It's combined arms warfare at its most lethal. The psychological warfare component of Napoleon's victory is equally sophisticated. By appearing weak and vulnerable, he encouraged the Allies to attack when and where he wanted them to, essentially allowing his enemies to defeat themselves. The emperor understood that the most efficient way to win a battle is to make your opponents fight on your terms rather than their own. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's tactical innovations at Austerlitz were revolutionary breakthroughs or simply the perfection of existing military principles, but the results speak for themselves. The Allied army, which outnumbered the French and held apparent advantages in position and supply, has been completely destroyed as an effective fighting force. It's the kind of decisive victory that changes the course of history. The human cost of this tactical masterpiece is sobering. While French casualties are relatively light, maybe 1,300 killed and wounded, the Allies have lost nearly 16,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. More importantly, they've lost their confidence, their cohesion, and their belief in their own military superiority. Napoleon hasn't just defeated an army, he's shattered the psychological foundation of the coalition against him. You can see the emperor's satisfaction as he reviews the battlefield. But it's the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who has executed a difficult job with professional competence. There's no wild celebration, no emotional outburst, just the calm recognition that his calculations were correct and his execution was flawless. It's the confidence of a man who understands that he's just redefined the art of war. The strategic implications of this tactical victory extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. Napoleon has demonstrated that the old European military system, based on rigid formations and predictable tactics, is obsolete. Future commanders will have to adapt to his innovations or face similar destruction. The emperor hasn't just won a battle, he's forced an entire continent to rethink how wars are fought. As you stand there beside the architect of this masterpiece, you realize you're witnessing the moment when Napoleon Bonaparte transforms from a successful general into a military legend. The tactical genius displayed at you're moving through the aftermath of Austerlitz as field surgeons work by flickering candlelight, and the human cost of Napoleon's tactical masterpiece becomes impossible to ignore. The moans of wounded soldiers echo across the frozen battlefield like a chorus of the damned, and you realize that military genius, no matter how brilliant, is always measured in blood. 16,000 Allied casualties lie scattered across the Moravian countryside, each one representing a family that will never be whole again, a story that ends in agony rather than glory. The medical facilities are overwhelmed beyond any reasonable capacity. Austrian and Russian army surgeons, trained to handle maybe a few dozen casualties from a typical skirmish, are facing thousands of wounded men who need immediate attention to survive. You watch as exhausted doctors work without anesthesia, using nothing but leather straps for patients to bite down on while limbs are amputated by candlelight. The screams are worse than any battle cry you heard during the fighting. French casualties are lighter but no less tragic for the families involved. Napoleon's tactical brilliance minimized his own losses, maybe 1,300 killed and wounded. But each French soldier who won't see another sunrise represents the same human cost as his Allied counterparts. You see young men from Normandy and Provence dying far from home, their last words calling for mothers who will never know exactly where or how their sons perished. The primitive state of battlefield medicine makes every wound potentially fatal. A musket ball to the leg that might be treatable today becomes a death sentence when the only options are amputation or gangrene. You watch surgeons making impossible decisions about which men might be saved and which are beyond help, triaging human lives with the cold efficiency that war demands. The lucky ones die quickly. The unlucky ones linger for days in agony. Here's a detail that most histories overlook: the psychological trauma affecting the survivors. Soldiers who lived through the battle are exhibiting what we now recognize as shell shock or PTSD, though 18th century medicine has no name for the condition. You see men staring blankly at nothing, unable to respond to direct questions, their minds apparently broken by what they've witnessed. The French call it nostalgia, a kind of homesickness so severe it can kill. The logistics of caring for so many wounded are staggering. There aren't enough bandages, not enough laudanum for pain relief, not enough clean water to wash wounds. Soldiers are using their own shirts as bandages, sharing precious drops of brandy to dull the pain, and improvising stretchers from muskets and greatcoats. The organized military machine that fought so efficiently this morning has become a desperate humanitarian crisis by nightfall. You notice something remarkable about the treatment of enemy wounded. Despite the bitter fighting, there's a professional courtesy between opposing medical personnel. French surgeons treat Russian patients alongside their own men. Austrian doctors share their limited supplies with French casualties, and wounded soldiers from all three armies lie side by side in improvised field hospitals. War may be politics by other means, but suffering transcends national boundaries. The religious dimension of battlefield medicine is equally striking. Chaplains from all three armies move among the wounded, offering last rites and final comfort regardless of nationality. You hear prayers in German, Russian, and French, sometimes simultaneously, as dying men seek peace with whatever gods they worship. The theological differences that help justify this war seem insignificant when facing individual mortality. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's relatively light casualties prove his tactical superiority, or simply reflect the collapse of Allied resistance before the fighting became truly bloody. But the human cost remains the same. Every number in the casualty reports represents a unique individual story. The Austrian farm boy who joined the army to escape poverty, the Russian serf fighting for a czar who considers him property, the French veteran following Napoleon because he believes in the revolutionary ideals the emperor represents. The evacuation of wounded soldiers creates its own logistical nightmare. Horse-drawn ambulances, when they exist at all, can carry only a few men at a time over roads that are barely more than frozen mud tracks. Most wounded soldiers have to walk if they can, or rely on comrades to carry them to safety. You see heartbreaking scenes of exhausted men supporting wounded friends, sometimes for miles, refusing to abandon brothers in arms even when their own survival is in doubt. The impact on local civilians adds another layer of tragedy to the aftermath. Moravian peasants, who had nothing to do with the imperial politics that brought 3 armies to their homeland, find their farms turned into battlefields and their homes converted into hospitals. You watch as local women risk their own safety to bring water and food to wounded soldiers, showing the kind of basic human compassion that transcends the artificial boundaries of nationality and politics. The primitive communication systems of the era mean that families back home won't learn the fate of their loved ones for weeks or even months. Wives and mothers across Europe will spend the winter wondering whether their men survived Austerlitz, with no way to get reliable information. The psychological cost of this uncertainty extends the battle's human impact far beyond the immediate battlefield. What makes the medical crisis particularly tragic is how preventable much of it was. Better planning could have positioned more medical personnel closer to the fighting. Improved logistics could have ensured adequate supplies of basic medical necessities. More importantly, diplomatic solutions might have prevented the battle entirely, saving thousands of lives that were sacrificed to imperial ambition and political miscalculation. As you move through the field hospitals and aid stations scattered across the battlefield, you realize that this is the true cost of military genius. Napoleon's tactical brilliance created a masterpiece of warfare, but masterpieces painted in blood carry a moral weight that transcends their artistic merit. The wounded and dying scattered across these frozen fields are the price of imperial ambition, and their suffering will continue long after the historians finish analyzing the tactical innovations that created it. The candlelight flickering across the faces of wounded soldiers creates an almost religious atmosphere, as if you're witnessing the immediate diplomatic earthquake that follows Napoleon's victory. And the political aftershocks are reshaping the European continent, even before the last wounded soldier is evacuated from the battlefield. The Third Coalition against France, which seemed so formidable just this morning, is crumbling faster than the ice on the Sachin ponds. Within hours of the fighting's end, centuries-old alliances are dissolving, and new power structures are emerging from the wreckage of traditional European diplomacy. Emperor Francis II of Austria is the first to crack under the pressure. You watch as Habsburg diplomats, who spent the morning planning victory celebrations, now scramble to arrange an immediate armistice before Napoleon decides to march on Vienna. The speed of this diplomatic reversal is breathtaking, from confident aggression to desperate supplication in less than 12 hours. It's the kind of political whiplash that destroys governments and topples dynasties. The human drama of diplomatic collapse is as fascinating as the battle itself. Count Cobenzl, Austria's chief negotiator, approaches French headquarters with the kind of nervous energy you'd expect from a man whose career depends on convincing Napoleon not to destroy his country. The Austrian diplomat, who this morning represented one of Europe's great powers, is now essentially begging for mercy from the upstart Corsican his government has spent years trying to eliminate. Here's where Napoleon's political genius matches his military brilliance. Instead of demanding unconditional surrender, he offers terms that are harsh but not impossible. The emperor understands that completely destroying Austria would create a power vacuum that might benefit his other enemies, particularly Britain and Russia. Better to leave France's II weakened but functional, serving as a buffer against future threats while acknowledging French supremacy. The Treaty of Pressburg, which will be signed within weeks of Austerlitz, represents a complete restructuring of Central European politics. Austria will lose Venice, Tyrol, and significant German territories, while Napoleon's German allies receive substantial territorial rewards. You're witnessing the birth of the Confederation of the Rhine, a French-dominated alliance that will replace the Holy Roman Empire as the organizing principle of German politics. Tsar Alexander I's reaction to defeat is more complex and ultimately more dangerous. The young Russian emperor doesn't seek immediate peace like his Austrian ally. Instead, he begins planning revenge. You can see the psychological impact of Austerlitz on Alexander's personality. The confident young monarch who woke up expecting easy victory has been replaced by a bitter, humiliated ruler who will spend the next decade plotting Napoleon's destruction. The British response to Austerlitz demonstrates the global implications of this Moravian battlefield. Prime Minister William Pitt, architect of the Third Coalition, reportedly dies of shock upon learning of the Allied defeat, though historians still argue whether the news actually killed him or simply coincided with his final illness. Either way, British gold that financed the coalition has been wasted, and London must now recalculate its entire European strategy. What makes this diplomatic revolution particularly remarkable is its speed. Traditional European diplomacy moved at the pace of horse-drawn couriers and formal court protocols. But Napoleon is forcing a new tempo that leaves his enemies constantly off balance. While Austrian and Russian diplomats are still trying to understand what happened at Austerlitz, French negotiators are already presenting them with accomplished facts that must be accepted or face even worse consequences. The impact on smaller German states is equally dramatic. Princes who spent centuries balancing between Austria and France now see clearly which way the wind is blowing. You watch as delegations from Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden arrive at French headquarters, eager to join Napoleon's new German Confederation before their more hesitant neighbors claim the best terms. It's political opportunism on a grand scale, but also realistic adaptation to new power realities. The religious implications of this political earthquake extend beyond immediate territorial changes. The Holy Roman Empire, which claimed direct descent from Charlemagne's Christian Empire, is effectively dead after Austerlitz. France's II will formally abandon the title within months, ending a political entity that survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, and the Protestant Reformation. Napoleon's victory represents the triumph of secular, revolutionary politics over traditional Christian monarchy. Historians still argue whether the diplomatic revolution following Austerlitz was inevitable given European political trends, or whether Napoleon's specific victory created unique opportunities that a different outcome might not have provided. What's certain is that the battle's political consequences extend far beyond the immediate participants to reshape the entire continental balance of power. The human cost of this diplomatic earthquake affects millions of people who never came near the battlefield. German peasants find themselves transferred from Austrian to French influence without any consultation about their preferences. Italian territories change hands like poker chips in a high-stakes game. Polish patriots see new hope for independence as Napoleon promises to restore their nation, while Polish conservatives fear the revolutionary changes that French influence might bring. You notice something fascinating about Napoleon's diplomatic style in victory. He combines magnanimity toward defeated enemies with ruthless exploitation of their weakness. Austrian negotiators are treated with courtesy and respect, but they're also presented with non-negotiable demands that reflect France's new position as Europe's dominant power. It's velvet-glove diplomacy backed by an iron fist that just demonstrated its effectiveness. The communication revolution that Napoleon represents extends to diplomacy as well as warfare. While traditional European courts still rely on formal protocols and elaborate ceremonies, French negotiators cut through diplomatic niceties to focus on practical results. Treaties that might have taken months to negotiate under the old system are hammered out in days, reflecting the new tempo of European politics. As you observe the diplomatic aftermath of Austerlitz, you realize you're witnessing the birth of modern European politics. The old system of balance between you're walking beside Napoleon as he conducts his victory tour of the Austerlitz battlefield, and you can see history crystallizing into legend with every step the emperor takes. This isn't just a general reviewing his triumph. This is the conscious creation of a myth that will define military excellence for centuries. Napoleon understands that battles are won twice, first on the field, then in the stories told about them, and he's already crafting the narrative that will make Austerlitz synonymous with tactical genius won. The emperor moves across the frozen ground with the measured pace of a man who knows he's walking through his own monument. Every detail of this victory walk is being carefully observed by his staff, recorded by his secretaries, and prepared for the bulletins that will carry news of French triumph across Europe. Napoleon is simultaneously experiencing his greatest moment and choreographing how it will be remembered by posterity. You notice something remarkable about the emperor's demeanor. There's no wild celebration, no emotional outburst of triumph. Instead, Napoleon displays the calm satisfaction of a master craftsman who has executed a difficult commission with professional competence. He pauses at key points on the battlefield. The Pratzen Heights where Soult's assault broke the Allied center, the Sachin Ponds where Russian soldiers drowned in retreat, and you can see him mentally cataloging the tactical lessons that made victory possible. The human dimension of Napoleon's victory walk is equally striking. The emperor stops to speak with wounded French soldiers, offering personal words of encouragement and ensuring they understand their sacrifice contributed to something historically significant. These aren't just propaganda gestures. Napoleon genuinely cares about his men, and they respond with the kind of devotion that money can't buy and fear can't create. Here's where Napoleon's political genius becomes as apparent as his military brilliance. He's already thinking beyond this single victory to its long-term implications. As he surveys the battlefield, the emperor is calculating how Austerlitz will affect his negotiations with Austria, his relationship with Prussia, and his ongoing struggle with Britain. This tactical masterpiece is just one move in a much larger strategic game that spans the entire European continent. The symbolic power of this moment isn't lost on anyone present. Napoleon is walking across ground where 3 emperors met in battle, and only one emerged victorious. The imagery is perfect for the bulletins and proclamations that will spread French propaganda across Europe. The self-made emperor defeating the hereditary monarchs who claim to rule by divine right. It's revolution triumphant over tradition, merit victorious over bloodline. You can see Napoleon's staff officers taking careful notes as the emperor shares his analysis of the battle's key moments. These observations will become the foundation for military education at French academies, the tactical principles that will guide future French commanders, and the strategic doctrine that will shape European warfare for the next generation. Austerlitz isn't just a victory, it's a textbook being written in real time. The emperor's treatment of enemy wounded and prisoners demonstrates the complexity of his character. While Napoleon can be ruthless in pursuit of political objectives, he shows genuine respect for courage regardless of which uniform it wears. You watch as he orders medical care for Russian and Austrian casualties, ensuring that enemy soldiers receive the same treatment as French troops. It's the kind of gesture that builds reputation and creates the moral authority that pure military force cannot achieve. The international implications of this victory walk extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. European courts are already receiving reports of Napoleon's triumph, and the emperor knows that every detail of his behavior will be analyzed for clues about French intentions. By displaying magnanimity in victory, he's sending a message that France can be a generous ally to those who accept the new European order, while demonstrating the consequences of continued resistance. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's famous comment about Austerlitz being the most beautiful day of my life was made during this victory walk or added later for dramatic effect. But the sentiment captures the emperor's genuine satisfaction with his achievement. This battle represents the perfect synthesis of his military and political talents, the moment when all his innovations in warfare and statecraft came together to produce decisive results. The religious symbolism of the victory walk isn't accidental either. Napoleon is walking across a battlefield on December 2nd, exactly 1 year after his coronation as emperor. The timing reinforces his claim to divine favor while subtly mocking the traditional monarchs who base their legitimacy on God's supposed blessing. If God truly chooses rulers, the emperor seems to be saying, then Austerlitz proves who enjoys divine support. You notice something fascinating about how Napoleon interacts with the physical evidence of his victory. He examines abandoned Austrian artillery pieces, studies the positions where Allied resistance collapsed, and traces the routes his own forces used to achieve their tactical objectives. The emperor is simultaneously savoring his triumph and conducting a professional analysis that will inform future campaigns. The propaganda value of this victory walk is enormous, but it's also genuine. Napoleon isn't just performing for his audience. He's genuinely proud of what his army has accomplished and wants to understand exactly how they achieved such decisive results. The emperor combines the showmanship of a natural politician with the intellectual curiosity of a serious student of warfare. As you accompany Napoleon across the battlefield where he achieved his greatest triumph, you realize you're witnessing the birth of a legend that will outlive empires and inspire soldiers for centuries. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Austerlitz will be studied as long as armies exist. But the image of Napoleon walking calmly across his conquered battlefield will become equally iconic. The emperor's victory walk represents more than personal satisfaction. It's the symbolic moment when revolutionary France definitively defeats the old European order. The man who rose from Corsican obscurity to continental. You're standing in the midst of history's most fertile breeding ground for military mythology, and you can watch in real time as the facts of Austerlitz begin their transformation into the legends that will inspire and mislead future generations of soldiers. The battle that ended just hours ago is already being reshaped by the human need to find meaning in chaos, to extract simple lessons from complex realities, and to create heroes worthy of the sacrifices made in their name. The myth-making begins immediately with Napoleon's own bulletins to the French people. The emperor understands that controlling the narrative is as important as winning the battle itself. So his official accounts emphasize French tactical brilliance while downplaying the role of Allied mistakes, weather conditions, and pure luck. You can see how selective editing transforms a complex military engagement into a simple story of genius triumphing over mediocrity. Here's where the legend starts to diverge from reality. Napoleon's famous son of Austerlitz becomes a symbol of divine favor rather than a meteorological coincidence. The fog that confused Allied movements gets reinterpreted as evidence of French tactical superiority, rather than an environmental factor that could have helped either side. Every element of the battle is being retrofitted to support the narrative of inevitable French victory under inspired leadership. The numbers themselves become mythological. French casualties, already light by the standards of Napoleonic warfare, get reduced even further in popular accounts. Allied losses, substantial but not unprecedented, are inflated to suggest a massacre of biblical proportions. The ratio between French and Allied casualties becomes a mathematical proof of tactical genius, rather than the result of specific battlefield conditions that might not be repeatable. You can see how different participants in the battle are already creating their own versions of events. French veterans emphasize their courage and skill, while minimizing the confusion and fear they actually experienced. Austrian survivors focus on the overwhelming odds and impossible conditions they faced rather than acknowledging tactical errors by their commanders. Russian accounts blame Austrian incompetence while downplaying their own contribution to the disaster. The transformation of individual incidents into legendary episodes is particularly fascinating to observe. The drowning of Russian soldiers in the Sachin ponds, tragic but limited in scope, becomes a symbol of complete Allied collapse. Soult's assault on the Pratzen Heights, brilliantly executed but not unprecedented in military history, gets elevated to the status of tactical innovation that revolutionized warfare. Every successful French maneuver becomes evidence of superhuman planning and execution. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's tactical innovations at Austerlitz were truly revolutionary or simply the skillful application of existing military principles. But the legend makers aren't interested in such nuanced analysis. The battle becomes a template for military genius that ignores the specific conditions, terrain, weather, enemy mistakes, and pure chance that made French victory possible. Future commanders will try to replicate Austerlitz without understanding the unique circumstances that created it. The human cost of mythologizing military victory becomes apparent as you observe how individual suffering gets subsumed into grand narratives of national glory. The Austrian farm boy who died of gangrene 3 days after the battle becomes a statistic in the story of French triumph. The Russian veteran who survived but lost his leg to a cannonball disappears entirely from accounts that focus on tactical brilliance rather than human consequences. What makes the Austerlitz mythology particularly powerful is how it serves everyone's psychological needs. French soldiers get a story that validates their sacrifices and proves their superiority over European rivals. Napoleon gets a reputation for invincibility that becomes a political weapon as valuable as his actual military forces. Even defeated enemies can find comfort in the idea that they lost to superhuman genius rather than their own incompetence. The international dimension of myth-making adds another layer of complexity. British accounts emphasize the role of Austrian and Russian mistakes while downplaying French tactical skill, since acknowledging Napoleon's military genius would undermine confidence in eventual British victory. Prussian observers, still neutral but watching nervously, focus on lessons that might help them avoid Austria's fate. Every nation interprets Austerlitz through the lens of its own strategic interests. You notice something particularly interesting about how the battle's religious symbolism gets incorporated into its mythology. Napoleon's victory on the anniversary of his coronation becomes evidence of divine favor, while the defeat of traditional Christian monarchs gets reinterpreted as God's judgment on corrupt old regimes. The same battle serves as proof of both revolutionary virtue and imperial destiny, depending on the audience. The speed with which Austerlitz mythology spreads across Europe demonstrates the power of early 19th century communication networks. Within weeks, simplified versions of the battle are being told in coffeehouses from London to St. Petersburg, each retelling adding new details and removing inconvenient complexities. The story becomes more dramatic and less accurate with each iteration. The educational impact of Austerlitz mythology will shape military thinking for generations. Staff colleges across Europe will teach the battle as an example of perfect tactical execution, often ignoring the specific conditions that made French success possible. Future commanders will try to recreate Napoleon's masterpiece, without understanding that military genius lies in adapting to unique circumstances rather than copying previous successes. As you observe the birth of the Austerlitz legend, you realize you're witnessing how history becomes mythology and mythology becomes doctrine. The complex reality of December 2nd, 1805, with its confusion, luck, human error, and environmental factors, is being simplified into a story of pure tactical genius that will inspire and mislead military. You're witnessing the final moments of a day that has fundamentally altered the trajectory of European civilization. And the legacy of the Three Emperors battle extends far beyond the immediate military consequences to reshape politics, warfare, and the very concept of leadership for generations to come. As the winter sun sets over the Moravian countryside, you can see the shadows of future conflicts already stretching across the continent, born from the seeds planted in this frozen soil. The immediate impact on the three emperors who gave this battle its name tells the story of how completely the old European order has been shattered. Napoleon emerges as the undisputed master of continental Europe, his reputation for invincibility established so firmly that future enemies will fight as much against his legend as against his actual armies. The psychological advantage gained at Austerlitz will prove as valuable as any territorial conquest, making French diplomacy more effective and enemy resistance more hesitant. Emperor Francis II of Austria faces the most immediate consequences of defeat. Within months, he'll formally dissolve the Holy Roman Empire, ending a political entity that claimed direct descent from Charlemagne and had survived for over 1,000 years. The Habsburg dynasty will continue, but as rulers of a reduced Austrian empire rather than the theoretical leaders of German Christendom. It's the end of medieval Europe's last great institution, killed by revolutionary French bayonets on a Moravian battlefield. Tsar Alexander I's response to humiliation will prove the most dangerous for Napoleon's long-term prospects. The young Russian emperor, his confidence shattered and his pride wounded, will spend the next decade plotting revenge against the man who exposed his military incompetence before all Europe. The seeds of the 1812 Russian campaign, Napoleon's eventual downfall, are being planted in Alexander's bitter reflections on this December defeat. The broader European response to Austerlitz demonstrates how completely the continental balance of power has shifted. Prussia, which remained neutral during this campaign, now faces the terrifying prospect of confronting French military supremacy alone. The Prussian army, still organized according to Frederick the Great's principles, will prove no match for Napoleonic warfare when they finally clash at Jena Auerstedt in 1806. Austerlitz has shown that the old military systems are obsolete. Here's where the battle's long-term significance becomes clear. Austerlitz doesn't just represent French victory over Austrian and Russian forces, but the triumph of revolutionary military principles over traditional European warfare. Napoleon's innovations in organization, tactics, and command structure will force every European army to modernize or face destruction. The battle becomes a catalyst for military reform across the continent. The impact on German politics proves equally revolutionary. The Confederation of the Rhine, established in Austerlitz's aftermath, creates a French-dominated alliance that excludes Austrian influence from German affairs for the first time in centuries. German nationalism, still in its infancy, receives a powerful stimulus as traditional loyalties to Austria and the Holy Roman Empire collapse. The path toward eventual German unification under Prussian leadership begins with Austrian defeat in Moravia. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's empire could have survived even without the mistakes that eventually led to his downfall. But Austerlitz certainly provides the foundation for French hegemony over Europe. The battle's psychological impact proves as important as its immediate territorial consequences, creating a reputation for French invincibility that will take years of defeats to overcome. The human cost of this imperial reshuffling extends far beyond the immediate battlefield casualties. Millions of Europeans find their political allegiances changed by diplomatic negotiations they had no voice in. German peasants become French allies overnight. Italian territories change hands like poker chips. Polish patriots see new hope for independence, while Polish conservatives fear revolutionary changes. The personal becomes political on a continental scale. The military lessons of Austerlitz will be studied and misunderstood for decades. Staff colleges across Europe will teach the battle as an example of perfect tactical execution, often missing the specific conditions that made French success possible. Future commanders will try to recreate Napoleon's masterpiece, without understanding that military genius lies in adapting to unique circumstances rather than copying previous victories. You can see how the battle's religious and ideological implications extend beyond immediate political consequences. Napoleon's victory over traditional Christian monarchs becomes evidence for revolutionary supporters that merit Trump's birthright, that talent defeats privilege, and that the old order based on divine right monarchy is finished. The ideological struggle between revolution and tradition that began in 1789 reaches its climax on the fields of Austerlitz. The international dimension of Austerlitz's legacy proves equally significant. Britain, the one major European power not directly involved in the battle, must now confront French continental dominance without reliable allies. The Royal Navy's control of the seas becomes Britain's only advantage against Napoleon's land-based empire, setting up the economic warfare that will eventually contribute to French defeat. The technological and organizational innovations demonstrated at Austerlitz will influence military development for the next century. Napoleon's corps system, his use of artillery, his coordination of different military arms, and his emphasis on speed and flexibility become the foundation for modern warfare. Military academies worldwide will study French methods and try to adapt them to their own national circumstances. As you stand on this battlefield where European history pivoted, you realize that Austerlitz represents more than just military victory. It's the moment when the modern world definitively defeated the medieval past. The battle's legacy will extend through the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna, the revolutions of 1848, and ultimately to the creation of modern Europe. 3 emperors met here, but only one understood that the future belonged to those who could adapt to revolutionary change. The irony of Austerlitz's legacy is that Napoleon's very success creates the conditions for his eventual downfall. By humiliating Austria and Russia so completely, by demonstrating French military superiority so decisively, the emperor ensures that as the last light fades from the Austerlitz battlefield, you find yourself walking slowly through the gathering darkness, your footsteps muffled by the snow that's beginning to fall again. The sounds of battle have long since faded, replaced by the gentle whisper of wind through the bare trees and the distant murmur of soldiers tending to their wounded comrades. The great drama of empires and emperors seems suddenly small beneath the vast winter sky, where stars are beginning to appear like tiny witnesses to the day's momentous events. You can still hear the echoes of what you've witnessed, the thunder of artillery that shook the frozen ground, the clash of bayonets in the morning mist, the cries of men who believed they were making history. But now those sounds are softening, becoming memories that will fade with time, while the consequences of this single day ripple outward through the years and decades to come. The immediate urgency of battle gives way to the longer rhythms of historical change, as inevitable and patient as the turning of seasons. The snow continues to fall, covering the scars left by cannon wheels and the dark stains where brave men bled for causes they may not have fully understood. Nature begins the slow process of healing that will eventually erase all physical traces of this day, leaving only the stories and the lessons for future generations to discover. In a few years, farmers will plant crops in soil enriched by the sacrifice of soldiers, and children will play in fields where empires once collided. As you pull your coat closer against the winter cold and begin the long journey home, you carry with you the knowledge of what ordinary men can accomplish when led by extraordinary vision, and what terrible costs are paid when the ambitions of emperors clash on the stage of history. The Battle of Austerlitz is ending, but its echoes will resonate through the corridors of power and the pages of history books for centuries to come, a reminder that single moments can indeed change the world. Sleep well, knowing that you've witnessed one of history's great turning points, where the old world died and the new world was born in the space of a single winter day. Sweet dreams.